Hello, everyone, and welcome to Past and Printed, the show where we take a look at a newspaper from today's date, but in a randomly selected city in a randomly selected year to see what people at the time were reading about and what was going on in their world. I'm your host, Lloyd, and I promise this wasn't planned, but even though we were just in Fredericton, New Brunswick in 1891, my selection program has landed us not too far away in Halifax, Nova Scotia, looking at the Monday, August 17th, 1891 edition of the Morning Herald. Since we haven't looked at a newspaper from Halifax before, I'll give some history and quick facts about the city, though being a large and influential city, it'll be a very rough overview. The area around Halifax has been populated by the Mi'kmaq First Nations people for at least 1,000 years prior to European colonization. The Mi'kmaq term for Halifax Harbor is Chebuktuk, which basically translates to Great Harbor. The Mi'kmaq used the Halifax area as a summer community. European colonization largely bypassed the modern Halifax era throughout the 1600s and into the 1700s, until the British settled in the area and founded the town on June 21st, 1749. This sparked Father Lalotre's War, with the French, Acadians, and First Nations people resisting British colonization of the area. The war lasted until a British victory in 1755. During the French and Indian War, which kind of overlapped with Father Lalotre's War, Halifax was used as a military base to counter the French fortress in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. It was also during this time that Halifax became the headquarters of the Royal Navy's North American Station, which it remained until 1818. During the American Revolution, Halifax was used as a staging area to conduct attacks on rebel-held territory. After the war, Halifax received an influx of British loyalists and continued to flourish throughout the 1800s as a center of transatlantic shipping and of British military activity. During and after the War of 1812, the city saw an influx of black refugees, mostly formerly enslaved people from Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Georgia. These refugees were also settled in New Brunswick as well as the British holding of Trinidad and Tobago. Fellow Titanic nerds will know that Halifax was the center of operations to recover the bodies of the victims of the 1912 sinking. Of the 333 bodies recovered, 150 are buried in Halifax. In 1917, Halifax was the site of the Halifax explosion, when a French ship carrying munitions collided with a Norwegian ship, which sparked a fire that then resulted in the largest man-made explosion until the development of the nuclear bomb. 2,000 people were killed, 9,000 injured, and essentially destroyed the city's north end. Though its economy slumped after the explosion and throughout the 1920s, Halifax continued to be a shipping center and played an even greater role in the Allied war effort during World War II than it did in World War I. The city continued to flourish during the Cold War, once again, thanks to continued investment by the Canadian military. In 1996, the city of Halifax was amalgamated with the town of Bedford, city of Dartmouth, and county of Halifax to form the modern municipality of Halifax. In modern times, shipping still plays a large part in Halifax's economy, as well as healthcare and education. According to the 1891 Canadian census, the city's population was 71,358, and in 2021, the population of the municipality was 465,703. And with that, let's jump into the Monday, August 17th, 1891 edition of the Morning Herald. Starting out on page 1, it looks like the front page is about half advertisements and various notices. The first actual article is a portion of an article from a different paper. The top of the column informs us that the piece is, quote, from the Evening Mail, end quote, probably referring to the Halifax Evening Mail, another newspaper owned by the same company, but published in the afternoons. The column also informs us that it is only but a sample of the whole. The piece is kind of an editorial about corruption by members of the Canadian government and legislatures, specifically Ontario Attorney General Sir Oliver Mowat and Nova Scotia Attorney General James Wilberforce Longley. According to the article, there were, quote, revelations before the Railway Committee of the Senate, unquote, involving misappropriation of funds by Honoré Mercier, the Premier of Quebec. Apparently, the attorneys general were in Ottawa to, quote, look into the question as to the extent of the power of the Dominion Parliament to inquire into the expenditures and doings of provincial legislatures, unquote. The article opines that Mowat and Longley likely fear investigations due to their own use of public money. In Nova Scotia, the writer states that the Liberal Party, the, quote, dishonest combination of tricksters and shysters that have been ruling this province since 1882, unquote, have borrowed and spent $3 million more than the province brought in revenue, and accuses the party of using at least 1/3 of that for quote-unquote partisan and corrupt uses. I may have noted this before, but online inflation calculators for the Canadian dollar only go back to 1914. However, using academic sources such as Urquhart and Buckley and Robert Allen, the Canadian dollar was worth about 30 to 35 times more in the 1890s than in 2026, so $3 million in 1891 would be around $90 to $105 million in 2026. I'll be using this estimate for the rest of the episode. And as always, these are in Canadian dollars, not US dollars, unless otherwise specified. The piece goes on to posit that it would be useless to petition the provincial legislatures to investigate this alleged corruption because the legislators are simply lackeys of the provincial governments who, quote, owe their seats to the very crimes that the legislature would be asked to expose, unquote. The piece then finishes by stating that Senator Power, that's Lawrence Godfrey Power of Nova Scotia, quote, can take out that little slip of paper on which he noted his objections to inquiring into Mercier's boodling operations and tear it up. He will find it of no further use, unquote. Though it appears that, unlike Mercier, who was removed from office later that year, nothing ever came of these accusations, and both Mowat and Longley continued to serve in government for several more decades. Moving on for now, a $20 reward, or about $600 to $700 these days, is being offered by George Pierce, Secretary of Game, for any information leading to the arrest of persons killing or possessing woodcocks or snipes before August 20th, or possessing any partridge before August 15th. Presumably, these would be violations of the hunting seasons for these birds. A letter to the editor suggests that readers attend Reverend Theodore G. Dowling's lectures on, quote-unquote, everyday life in the Holy Land. By Holy Land, they mean the region of Palestine, of course, which was under control of the Ottoman Empire at the time. Apparently, Reverend Dowling is on a lecture tour of the UK, US, and Canada for the benefit of the Jerusalem Bishopric Mission, talking about, quote, the return of the Jews in these latter days to their own land, unquote, i.e. the early Zionist movement. From Prince Edward Island, fishermen on the North Shore report that mackerel sharks are plentiful this season and are frightening the fish, quote, so they do not bite, unquote. One fisherman even reports that while trying to haul in a mackerel, a shark jumped over the gunwale with such force that it broke the opposite gunwale, allowing the shark to escape into the water. Then there is a section titled News by Telegraph, which appears to be short pieces from around the country and the world, including that Miss Cameron, daughter of Major General Cameron of the Royal Military College, was married in Kingston, Ontario to M. Gray, an English civil engineer. No date of the marriage was given. There's a few short pieces reporting on more testimony on bills in the local legislature, but they provide very little context and are meant basically as follow-ups to stories from an earlier edition of the paper that readers would already be familiar with. The Empress of China, that is the ocean liner RMS Empress of China of the Canadian Pacific Steamship Company, arrived in Penang on August 15th on a third trip around the world. She left the same night for Shanghai. 3 Canadian harvesters, that is, I believe farm workers, who had recently immigrated to Pembina, North Dakota, were ordered barred from the U.S. and to be returned to British territory under the Alien Contract Labor Laws. The 3 men admitted that they came to the U.S. under contract to work. Due to a depression in the iron trade, ironworks in Cumberland, UK have been suspended. 6,000 men are out of work and hundreds are on the verge of starvation. Local authorities have decided to start public works to give employment to the, quote, many idle men in the district, unquote. A man named Orman took out a warrant on Saturday for William Ryan, a boy who Orman alleges stole $24 from his house on Friday. Oliver Hurd, a green goods grocer who was committed to court for trial, was admitted to bail for the amount of $700, or about $21,000 to $24,500 in 2026. The paper calls this, quote, a sad sight from the police courts on Saturday night, unquote. I call it a bit of BS. It appears a 75-year-old, one-legged man named Thomas Nolan was brought before the magistrate. His wife, the paper says, quote, is very old, probably older than her husband, unquote, and had accused Thomas of assaulting and abusing her. With standard Victorian-era sentiments, quote, her demeanor betrayed the evident fact that she is the ruler of the household, and as the prisoners seemed penitent, His Honor advised them to go home and be friends again, unquote. Of course, he couldn't have assaulted her. Can't you see that she wears the pants in the relationship? Mrs. Nolan, for her part, refused to walk out of the court with her husband, saying to a policeman, he is a villain, so he is. The Halifax city engineer has just finished a survey for a new water main on the extreme north end. It will apparently be a boon to the North Enders, supplying running water where there currently is none. The article boasts that the main can be shut off and cleaned or run while the present main is being cleaned without shutting off the whole water supply. Then there is a short article titled, She Lost $150. A Miss Norton, a visitor to Halifax, reported to the city marshal on Saturday that she had lost $150 in notes on Barrington Street on Friday afternoon. That would be around $4,500 to $5,250 today. She had been keeping the money between the pages of a book, apparently with the edges of the notes hanging out. She realized she'd lost some of her money when she went to transact some business at Mann Brothers on Prince Street. Ms. Norton was adamant that she held the book tight enough in her hand to prevent the bills from slipping out. She believes it's possible someone saw some of the bills protruding from the book and, quote, sneaked up behind her and stole them, unquote. I really don't want to victim blame, but come on, Miss Norton, just tuck those bills inside if you're going to hold them in your book. Then there's a little spot titled, What the Blowing Was For Friday. We're told the steam whistle of the Halifax Illuminating and Motor Company was sounded around 11 p.m. on Friday night. The whistle was blown to call the superintendent of the factory, Mr. Cogswell, who could not be reached by phone, although the article states that the 2 attempts were required due to, quote-unquote, some mistake. The superintendent had been in Dartmouth. He then heard the whistle and promptly telephoned the factory. I don't know the geography of Halifax well enough to know where this factory, which they refer to as a station, was located, but I imagine the whistle was plenty loud, which must have made the noise at 11 p.m. all the more startling for anyone living nearby. We then get a translation of the different sets of blasts from the whistle and who they're meant to signal. 1 long and 2 short blows are for the incandescent linemen. Remember, this is a lighting factory. 1 long and 3 short for the arc linemen. 1 long and 4 short for the superintendent. 1 long and 5 short for the engineers. 3 long and 3 short as a general alarm, which seems like it ought to be quicker than that. And 1 blow of 30 seconds to mark 5 o'clock p.m. A variety of eucalyptus is now in bloom at the Halifax Nursery on the corner of Robbie and North Streets, or maybe that's Roby and North Streets. It is believed to be the first time that this variety of eucalyptus has flowered in the country. Unfortunately, a 4-year-old girl named Ines died of diphtheria on Saturday night at 9 Granville Street. The poor girl had been sick for 8 days before her passing. At the time of printing, it appears there were only 2 other known cases of diphtheria in the city, one on Queen Street and the other on West Street. Mr. J. L. Stewart, publisher of the Chatham World and Commodore of the Miramichi Yacht Squadron, is in Halifax attending the annual gathering of the Oddfellows at Yarmouth. The young people of St. Mark's Church will, quote, have an entertainment in St. Mark's Hall this Monday evening in aid of the building fund, unquote. There will be rehearsed programs, cake and ice cream, and the children expect a full house. In other St. Mark's Church news, the Young Men's Temperance and Benevolent Society intend to hold their annual parade today, that's August the 17th. They will apparently be the only society in the Catholic Temperance Union to parade today. Although the Old Benevolent Society and young people may also march, the route of the parade is then laid out by the paper, and we're told that it will start at 8:45 a.m. A large number of people are expected, and proceeds are to be devoted to the building fund. And finally, on page 1, there is a number of death notices, mostly for very young children, which was unfortunately quite common in those days. The notices give the name, age, religion, cause of death, and the cemetery they're to be laid to rest in. I will read these all pretty much verbatim. Teresa D., aged only 14 days, Roman Catholic, died of convulsions and shall be buried in the Holy Cross Cemetery. Morris Arthur Kennedy, 8 months, Catholic, died of cholera infantum, will also be buried in Holy Cross Cemetery. Flory B.H. Usher, 4 months, Methodist, died of meningitis and will be buried in Camp Hill Cemetery. Ava E. Burlinson, 8 months, Methodist, died of diarrhea, also to be buried in the Camp Hill Cemetery. Percy H. Russell, 7 months, Episcopalian, another cholera infantum death, to be buried in the Camp Hill Cemetery. Sarah Frame, 87 years, Episcopalian, died of old age and diarrhea, to be buried in the Camp Hill Cemetery. Mary Quinn, 76 years, Roman Catholic, cause of death is paralysis, to be buried in Holy Cross Cemetery. And finally, Mabel Lottie Innes, 4 years and 8 months. She was Episcopalian and died of diphtheria, as mentioned earlier. She will be laid to rest in the Camp Hill Cemetery. And that's it for page 1, unfortunately on a bit of a down note, but let's move on to page 2. Page 2 also has a lot of advertisements. In fact, about 4.5 out of 8 columns are mostly ads and other notices, but, gotta pay those bills somehow. The first story on page 2, though, is titled, How Paquot Sneaked Away, and is related to the ongoing investigation into Premier Mercier's misappropriation of funds. The Paquot referred to here is Ernest Paquot, a Quebecois lawyer and journalist, and owner of the Quebec City newspaper Le Lecteur, who apparently played an important role in the election of Mercier's Parti National, now the Parti Libéral Québec. Mr. Paquot had been summoned to Ottawa by the Senate Railway Committee to give evidence. Apparently, testimony had been given that implicated Paquot in being a go-between for the Mercier government in siphoning off $100,000 of a $280,000 subsidy. That's $3 million to $3.5 million of an approximately $9.4 to $9.8 million subsidy in 2026. And Paquot apparently, quote, exacted a heavy commission for political purposes, unquote. The Senate wired Paquot on August 10th and received the following reply on the same day, quote, Mr. Paquot has left town when the message was received, signed Le Lecteur, unquote. However, according to testimony from Inspector O'Leary, no first name given or who he works for, Paquot had lied and hadn't left Quebec City until the 11th and hadn't planned to sail to Europe from New York until the 15th. Inspector O'Leary testified that he traveled to the electeur offices to serve a summons on Mr. Paquot and Mr. Greiner, the clerk of the Legislative Council, and was told that Mr. Paquot had left on Saturday, August 8th. However, the secretary, a Mr. Edge, first told O'Leary that Paquot had gone to, quote, New York or to some other place in the United States, unquote. O'Leary accused Mr. Edge of not being truthful, after which Mr. Edge left the room and came back confirming that Paquot had left for New York. O'Leary then also found 2 tickets to France. O'Leary continued that he discovered that Paquot actually hadn't left for New York until Tuesday, August 11th. The paper accuses both Mercier and Mr. Laurier, that's Wilfrid Laurier, future Prime Minister of Canada, on advising Paquot to leave town, knowing that he would be called as a material witness. Le Lecteur put out a statement saying that Paquot had been planning a month-long trip to Europe as ordered by his doctors, and that he had alerted Messrs. Laurier and Mercier of this fact. Their statement also says that Petco has purchased his return ticket on the SS Parisienne, leaving from Liverpool on September 17th. The paper then goes on to accuse Mr. Laurier of being the quote-unquote grit leader and was anxious of Petco's testimony. It should also be noted that Wilfrid Laurier was not ever officially found to have participated in the same misappropriation of funds as Mercier, and instead went on to become the first French-Canadian Prime Minister of Canada from 1896 to 1911. This piece is followed by an article titled Mercier's Muddle, so I'll let you guess what that's about. It talks about testimony from a contractor Armstrong, who offered evidence that, quote, proves conclusively that at least $100,000 of the $280,000 local subsidy has been stolen and appropriated to pay the debts of Mercier and his friends and for grit political purposes in Quebec. And I'll point out real quick that these articles keep using the term grit, and for any non-Canadians, grit is the nickname for members of the Liberal Party, referring to their lineage from the Clear Grits, a reform movement that wanted a party that was, quote, all sand and no dirt, clear grit all the way, unquote. In what might have seemed shocking during the late 20th century, but seems all the more common these days, newspapers were often aligned with political parties, and the Morning Herald seems to be decidedly a conservative party paper, or at least an anti-liberal party newspaper. It goes on to predict that Mercier will be compelled to resign. He was dismissed, and that in losing him, Laurier will lose his chief support in federal politics as, quote, it was Mercier's Boodle which enabled the Grit Party to carry a majority of Quebec at the last federal election, unquote. And I also have to say I really like the term Boodle. It just refers to political bribery or graft, as well as being a general term for money, but it's a fun word to say. And if you thought that was it for the Mercier investigation, think again. There's another article on page 2 titled, Further Revelations. Petco got another $100,000 from the Sorel Railway. Other subsidies were bled by the Grit Boodler in the same cool fashion. How the Grit leaders raised funds for the last election. Apparently, a lawyer, Barwick, and Professor Cockburn went to Quebec on Saturday, August 15th, to examine bank records on behalf of the Senate investigation, and are expected to return to Ottawa on Wednesday, August 19th. According to the Herald, they are expected to prove that, quote, large sums of money, not less than $100,000, were procured from the banks by Petco just before the federal election last March, unquote. The Herald once again accuses Petco of being a major player in the Boodling, and that Laurier's statements and Lecture's explanations about Petco's leaving for Europe are disingenuous. Finally, moving on from the Boodle case, the next section is made up of a couple different dispatches related to a ban on rye exports by the Russian government, made in an attempt to mitigate the effects of the Russian famine of 1891 to 1892, also known as the Tsar's famine. A poor growing season coupled with a lack of logistical infrastructure and a lack of grain reserves eventually caused the deaths of an estimated 400,000 people. The articles in the Herald talk about a cabinet, it doesn't say which cabinet, meeting in Berlin to discuss the impacts of the Russian ban on grain exports and how to minimize the impacts on, quote, the poorer classes who are wholly dependent upon rye bread, unquote. The article also asserts that Russian commissions reported to the government that there actually was enough grain in storage, that the distress was overrated, and that the harvest wasn't as bad as alleged. I think those 400,000 people would beg to differ, although I don't know if that was actually an assertion made by the Russian investigators or the Western newspapers, who were just riled up at the thought of an increase in grain prices. Because, as the next article points out in a dispatch from London, rye prices have already risen 8 shillings in Amsterdam. It's then pointed out that Germany imports 3.5 million quarters of rye on average from Russia. I think a quarter of rye in this case translates to 8 bushels, making it 28 million bushels that Germany imports. Holland imports over 1 million quarters, Italy 500,000 quarters, Norway and Sweden 1.5 million quarters. The United States can apparently only supply 1 million quarters to other countries, meaning the loss must be replaced by wheat. It's also feared that if the weather in Europe doesn't improve, America will be in a position to control the wheat market and prices will increase even further. A book titled In Darkest Russia has met with strong sales and issued a second edition. The article doesn't say who the book is written by, but only that it is, quote, an exposure of the wrongs from which Hebrews in Russia suffer, unquote. This second edition apparently includes a list of more persecutions against Jews in Russia than the first edition did. One incident is described in which Empress of Russia Maria Feodorovna was due to inspect troops of the Russian army and requested that not only should no Jewish soldiers be included in the inspection, but that they should be confined to their barracks. Also included is a letter from the Duke of Westminster calling it, quote, the inhumanity of the Russian authorities astounding and almost incredible, unquote. There are plans in Boston to establish an all-American amateur rowing association. In this case, American seems to mean the U.S. and Canada, as it lists several Canadian and American organizations that are to meet and establish, quote, an all-American championship regatta. Have you ever wondered, is there profit in sardines? Well, wonder no longer. The Eastport sardine factories are at the height of their season, apparently. Herring is currently plentiful and cheap, costing about $2 or $60 to $70 today per hogshead, as opposed to $28 or $840 to $980 earlier this season. The article states that sometimes entire families work in these sardine factories, with children earning as much as $1 per day, or about $30 to $35 in 2026. While some men earn $30, $40, or even $50 per week, being between $900 and $1,750 a week in 2026. Not a bad wage for tinning fish, I suppose. Once the fish are tinned, they are apparently shipped out as quickly as possible to New York, being the chief distribution center for America. There's also a piece called West India Islands. England wants to give them to Canada. After starting out by stating that the only governmental offices that, quote, show any kind of life are the Colonial and Admiralty, unquote, the article states that the British cabinet will absolutely reject the idea of a West India Confederation, but instead proposes to, quote, unite the West Indies to Canada by closer ties of commerce and intercourse, unquote. And the West Indies, meaning the Caribbean islands. A colonial agent stated that the government's pretext for rejecting any further amount of self-governance by the West Indies was the typical Victorian-era racism. That's my words, not theirs. The reason being that the population is, quote, mostly ignorant and unfit for self-control, unquote. However, the real reason, states the colonial agent, is that the subjects in places like Jamaica and the Bahamas are extremely discontented with British rule, who'd have thought, and that the West Indies should become dependencies of Canada, where, quote, it is believed that the bulk of the population is considered to be devoted to British rule, unquote. There is a notice that a biography of the late Sir John A. Macdonald, written by his nephew, Colonel J.P. Macpherson, is the only authentic biography of the departed Prime Minister. Directly below this is another notice, courtesy of Lady Macdonald and Hugh Macdonald, MP, stating that the biography written by Lieutenant Colonel James Pennington Macpherson has no sanction or approval and contains statements which are entirely incorrect. Then we've got some birth notices. On August 12th, a son was born to Mr. and Mrs. J.S. McLeod. At Lakesville in Kings County, a son was born on August 6th to Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Reed. And at Kentville on July 29th, a daughter was born to Mr. and Mrs. John Leopold. Then some more happy news. We have marriage notices. On August 12th, Arthur Bowles of London was married to Georgia Matheson of Lardois at St. George's Church. Also on August 12th at Wolfville, Reverend William M. Smallman, minister of the Baptist Church at Dartmouth, was married to Lillian J. Benjamin. And at Annapolis on August 11th, Walter S. Buckler of Dalhousie West was married to Florence May of St. John's, New Brunswick. Unfortunately, then we move on to a few more death notices, a few of which are repeats from the notices on page 1, so I'll just cover the new ones. On August 16th in Halifax, Henry, third son of John and Mary A. Nodell, passed away at age 20. The funeral will take place at his father's residence at 450 Maynard Street on Thursday at 3 p.m. Friends and acquaintances are invited to attend without further notice. It then asks for Boston and St. John, New Brunswick papers to copy this notice. On August 14th, Florence Edward McGee, aged 5 years and 5 months, died of diphtheria. She was the only daughter of Annie E. and George McGee of the Post Office Department in Ottawa. At Englewood, Annapolis County, on August 5th, Henriette Brown, oldest child of Charles Francis and wife of Robert Brown, passed away, aged 41 years. At Round Hill, Annapolis County, on August 11th, Lucy Randolph, wife of Frederick Fitzrandolph, died, aged 45 years. At Berwick, on August 8th, Miss Lillian Coldwell, daughter of David Coldwell, died, aged 23 years. And in a tragic follow-up to one of the birth notices, at Lakeville, both Ethel Reed, wife of Arthur Reed, and their infant daughter passed away on August 11th, only 5 days after Ethel gave birth to their son. And aside from several long lists of people who arrived at Halifax's various hotels, that is going to do it for page 2. We're moving on to page 3. So you'll be shocked to hear that page 3 contains more coverage of the Mercier, Laurier, Pacot corruption investigation, but this time with even more aggression. The headline here reads, "Crushing exposure of grit rascality in all its hideousness produces a sensation throughout Canada. Mercier and Langelier equally guilty, with swindler-in-chief the fleeing Pacot. Views of all sections of the Dominion press. Some grit papers denounce the barefaced robbery, but the Halifax Chronicle maintains an oppressive silence." What then follows is a number of excerpts from different papers around Canada, noting their political allegiance and each with a summarizing headline such as "Barefaced Thieves and Whining Hypocrites" and "Candidates for the Penitentiary." However, under the headline "An Oppressive Silence" and listing the Halifax Chronicle, grit is just a blank space with several inches of paper, and then the column continues on with more excerpts. And while I personally don't like the concept of media having political allegiances in the first place, there is something kind of amusing about the just continuous hammering they're giving these guys. It's almost a New York Post level of blatant opining versus factual reporting. But aside from all that, there are 2 columns of the page titled The Herald's Diary, which contains little snippets and short local stories. As per usual, I'll pick out a few to read here. The American steam yacht Sagamore from Montreal to New London arrived in port on Saturday night on her return home. And this just kind of seems like using your newspaper to complain about personal issues. We're told, a correspondent wants to know what time the last car is supposed to leave the Richmond streetcar stables. He was left last night, though he thinks he was on time. A convention of the Baptist ministers in charge of the colored congregations through the provinces will open at Preston on the first Sunday in September. An 8-year-old son of William Mullins of Lower Prospect, while playing on Councillor Ryan's fishing stage, fell over the head of the wharf and drowned. We're not told when this happened, but it must have been recently. The steamer State of Indiana of the Allen and State Line arrived at 1:30 this morning from Boston and sailed at 6 for Prince Edward Island. She had 140 passengers for Halifax and 115 for the eastward journey. The steamer Halifax also arrived from Boston at 7 o'clock last evening with 160 passengers. Michael Grady, the man who was injured in the Chesapeake gold mine some time ago, died on Saturday. Dr. McLean of Muscadobit Harbor and Dr. Black of Halifax trepanned the man's skull. That is, they drilled a hole or removed part of the skull in an attempt to relieve pressure on the brain. The paper says that everything possible was done for the injured man, to no avail. And this is a new one, a newspaper simply describing a cartoon featured in a different publication. We're told the leading cartoon in the Grip this week is very funny. The Grip was a satirical magazine published in Toronto between 1873 and 1894. The article says it is entitled The Chick's in Danger and represents Lord Abbot as an agitated hen cooped up in a barrel and greatly concerned for her chickens, the chickens being the members of the ministry, who are being stealthily stalked by a couple of cats, representing the Public Accounts Committee and the Privileges and Elections Committee. The general contents of the paper, both pictorial and literary, are up to Gript's high standards. The newspaper office apparently has in their possession a riveting hammer dug up by J.I. Brown of Wolfville in September of 1870. Not sure why they decided to talk about it right now. The hammer was apparently found under 3 feet of ground, amongst other blacksmithing discards, and is thought to be a French hammer used by the Acadians before they were expelled. The cornerstone of the Halifax Oddfellows Temple on Buckingham Street is to be laid on Tuesday of next week. There will be a procession to the temple, followed by a speech from Reverend Anderson Rogers, and then a concert will be given by the Oddfellows. We've got a summary of a cricket match between the Wanderers and Garrison. Those are the team names. I know absolutely nothing about cricket, but apparently the Wanderers won by 1 run and 7 wickets to spare, whatever that means. There's also an article about a recent rainstorm. The piece is titled, "Another Costly Rainstorm, How Halifax Streets Are Washed into the Ocean." It recounts the rain of the previous day, which apparently started just after 4 p.m., and by 6 p.m., quote, "It had become a torrent. The streets were transformed into brooks, and great damage was done to our temporary roadways," unquote. They're talking, of course, about unpaved streets, as they say that any perishable material was washed into the sewers and, quote, "thence into the harbor, leaving the roadway more than ever like the bed of a dried-up brook," unquote. So, a bit hyperbolic, saying the roads were literally washed into the ocean, but that seems par for the course for this paper. It seems this is a frequent occurrence because the article goes on to posit that the cost of the previous day's damage and that of recent years would, quote, "probably pay the interest on a fund big enough to have paved half the city," unquote. The paper does note, however, that after the rainstorm subsided about 6:30 p.m., quote, "a beautiful double rainbow appeared in the western sky and lasted until sunset," unquote. In addition to cricket, the Halifax Herald also has the professional baseball scores from the weekend. The paper just lists the cities, but I'll give the team names as they would have been in 1891. First, we have the National League scores from Saturday, August 15th. At Brooklyn, Chicago White Stockings 6, Brooklyn Grays 2. At New York Gothams 4, Cincinnati Reds 4. The game was ended by darkness. At Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Quakers 4, Pittsburgh Alleghenies 2. The game in Boston was postponed due to rain. Then we have the American Association scores from Saturday. At St. Louis Brown Stockings 7, Cincinnati Kelly's Killers 3. At Louisville, Columbus Salons 8, Louisville Colonels 7. At Washington, Philadelphia Athletics 6, Washington Statesmen 3, and the game in Boston was also postponed due to rain. Then finally we have the American Association scores from Sunday, August 16th. At St. Louis 8, Cincinnati 0. At Louisville 11, Columbus 7. The American bicycle record for 10 miles was broken on Sunday, August 16th in Illinois during the annual road race of the Illinois Cycling Club. A bicyclist named Quistley finished the race with a time of 30 minutes 9 seconds, breaking the previous record of 30 minutes and 11 seconds. Then the next couple columns are extensive lists of ships arriving, leaving, updates on Halifax ships and other ports, and a list of arriving passengers and what ships they arrived on. And finally, for page 3, Matsuda Sorakichi, the famous Japanese wrestler, died in New York City on August 16th at only 33 years old. He had apparently been suffering from consumption, i.e. tuberculosis, for some time. And that's going to do it for page 3. Somehow these pages are all ending in death of some sort. I don't know why. But regardless, on to our 4th and final page. The first 2 columns on page 4 are taken up by Wakeman's Wanderings, which is a syndicated column by Edgar L. Wakeman, who, according to the Maritime Heritage Project of San Francisco, was born in 1863 to ship captain Edgar Wakeman Sr. and Mary Lincoln. This particular essay is titled Pit Brow Lasses as Seen at Their Grimy Toil. It describes Wakeman's travels to Wigan, England, located between Manchester and Liverpool, right in the heart of England's coal country. He describes the village and then the coal mines referred to as pits, and then goes into detail about the women working in these mines and the types of work they do. Basically, he describes 5 types of jobs and the women that do them. There's washers who wash dirt from the pieces of coal, cobblers who burn coke from the, quote, fine coal and refuse, unquote, coke being the high carbon fuel used in steelmaking. There's tippers who catch truckloads of coal being unloaded from the mine elevator, bring them to the tip, and dump them onto the screens. From there, the screeners pick up non-coal debris from the big screens as coal passes through them. This apparently requires the least amount of strength, but the most amount of dexterity. And finally, there's the levelers or fillers who level out the screened coal that goes into wagons to make sure that the load is distributed evenly. Wakeman then goes on to describe the actual women doing these jobs. He does call them, quote, the finest formed in all of England, unquote. Talks about their clothing and a little about their living conditions and pay. Then there's a list of all the ships in port at Halifax Harbor, broken down by the type of ship. And really that's about it. The rest of the page is taken up with railroad schedules and more ads, a lot of them for hotels and shipping lines. I do actually kind of find these kind of interesting as an ocean liner steamship nerd. For example, the SS Halifax advertises the shortest and most direct route to Boston, New York, and all ports in the United States. Well, certainly not all ports. Anyway, it sails from Halifax every Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. and from Boston every Saturday at noon. And if you want to go to Newfoundland, the Red Cross line will take you on Saturdays and Tuesdays. You'll pay $18 for saloon class or $9 for second class. All fares include meals in the stateroom or berth. Or you can take an Allen Line steamer from Halifax to Liverpool and back every 2 weeks, either on the Carthaginian, Caspian, or Nova Scotian. And that, I believe, is going to do it for the Monday, August 17th, 1891 edition of the Halifax Morning Herald. I definitely kind of found this interesting as it reminded me of like a Victorian era Nova Scotian New York Post. Not that that's necessarily a compliment, but it's certainly interesting. While government corruption is certainly serious, I do kind of have to wonder if the Morning Herald would have devoted so much space to the investigation if either the paper didn't have an overt political allegiance or if Mercier was a member of the Conservative Party. Once again, though, and we see this over and over, that it's kind of fascinating that no matter how much has happened in the past 135 years, both in Canada and the US, there are some aspects of politics and the media that either haven't changed or have come back around, not necessarily in a good way. So I hope you found that interesting as well, and if you did, please consider subscribing on whatever platform you're listening or watching on. And if you're listening first thing in the morning, if you ever want a really good cup of coffee in a hurry, then use Lyman's extract of coffee, made from the best mocha in Java, rich and fine flavored, wholesome, refreshing, simplicity itself. No coffee pot needed, no grounds, a 25-cent bottle makes 25 cups. Thanks again for listening to Past and Printed. I've been your host, Lloyd, and I hope your next news is all good news.